Hi, I'm JP Collins, and this is the Book of Hours segment entitled Christmas. Julie is out on doing some research for another segment, but today I want to talk about a book called The Battle for Christmas. In his 1996 book, Battle for Christmas, Stephen Nissenbaum goes deeply into the historical record to reveal the roots of the Christmas that we celebrate today. As a child growing up Jewish, Nissenbaum was fascinated and obsessed with everything surrounding Christmas. For those of us who live in the secular or Christian world in America, we kind of take this celebration of Christmas kind of for granted and think that basically the way we celebrate Christmas is the way we've always celebrated Christmas, ever since time immemorial. Although a lot of people that think that Christmas is too secular and too commercial, the Christmas that we celebrate today has actually been that way longer than we think, and the traditions that we celebrate and think of as ancient are actually younger than we actually believe. I'm going to talk about 5 myths that I've identified using Nissenbaum's book. But first, a little background. Christmas, the way it's been celebrated up to the 1820s, was really a season. It was not just a holiday, a particular holiday, nor was it just Christmas and New Year's. It was an entire season. And it was the season that was the result, that was the culmination of the harvest. So all through the spring, through the summer, and through the autumn, men would work on the farms. And in the wintertime, after the harvest was completed and the fields were cleared, there was a lot of food that was available, there was a lot of alcohol that was available, and there was fresh meat that wasn't cured, and it was available, and there was lots of food and lots of drink and lots of time on their hands. So what do men do when they're not working and there's lots of things to partake of? They party. And that partying took the form of something called wassailing. Wassailing was a tradition that developed throughout Europe, and it was in the rural areas and in the cities too, where men would go around in groups, and women would participate in this too, and they would go to the lord of the manor and demand that they be given entry, and they demanded the best of the food, the best of the wine, the best of the beer, whatever it might be. And you'll hear some of these kinds of things in some of the Christmas carols that we have now and then. But they would basically partake in sort of a role reversal where the lord of the manor would become the servant and the servants were the lords. And the idea of wassailing also surrounded the concept of misrule. So people could just carry on and get drunk and party and no consequences, and again put themselves upon the unsuspecting lord who actually knew that was going to happen, but they never knew when it was going to happen. Wassailing became a problem in the new urban setting of the Industrial Revolution, and it became problematic specifically for the wealthy 1%. They didn't like the misrule, and especially in America, they didn't like the idea of mob rule, of democracy in the first place. And so this tradition of wassailing was abhorrent to them, and they really just didn't like it and were trying to find ways to get around it. Which brings us to our first myth. Santa Claus is an age-old character who comes from Europe and as ancient as the day is long. Well, he is from Europe. He was a saint. Saint Nicholas was a bishop who came from the area around Turkey, and he's the patron saint of children, of Russia, and of Greece. There's also a Saint Nicholas ritual in the Netherlands, where good children are rewarded and bad children are given the switch. However, he's still represented as a bishop and not really a jolly old elf or anything that we come to think of as Santa Claus. Santa Claus didn't really appear until the 1820s with the the writing and publication of the poem A Visit with St. Nicholas by Clement Clarke Moore. Now, Clement Clarke Moore, everybody seems to think that he was, this benevolent guy and, kind of this dude that wrote this poem, but really Clement Clarke Moore was pretty much the upper echelons of the 1% in New York City. He belonged to a historical society called the Knickerbockers. The Knickerbockers were basically made up the same type of class. They were primarily English, they were patrician, they were the 1%, and they wanted to see, they wanted to control the narrative that surrounded New York City, how it was perceived to the world, and they did so by creating different myths and ideas to make it seem like New York City was a quaint old world town, like New Amsterdam might have been, or Amsterdam is. And it wasn't, they didn't want it to be considered a bustling town like, say, London or whatever it was becoming, a very commercialized hub. They still wanted to see it as a more not rural, but a more a smaller city with slower times and old ways. And the Knickerbockers were made up of people like Washington Irving, who is famous for writing the Sleepy Hollow book or story with Ichabod Crane, and also Rip Van Winkle. There was also a man named John Pintard, and John Pintard was one of the first people to come up with the idea of creating Saint Nicholas, and he put forth the idea that Saint Nicholas should be the patron saint of New York City. Now, this was a patron saint that was not necessarily the one that was the patron saint of Russia and Greece, but he was something similar. He was a benevolent being, and he was this character that he kind of made up. Washington Irving later took that idea and included him, Saint Nicholas, in one of his books, the history of the Knickerbocker history of New York City. Where St. Nicholas became kind of a character who appeared in a dream, and he was an old soul from the old world and smoked a long pipe and so forth. It wasn't until later that Clement Clarke Moore took those two ideas and kind of put them together and put them together with other ideas and came up with the Santa Claus that we all know. Now, Santa Claus that he created was a jolly old elf, and he wasn't the patrician stately, bishop that he once was in Europe. Now he was this benevolent old soul who came down the chimney and looked like a peddler unpacking his bag. The thing is that Clement Clarke Moore wanted to create a persona that was of a different class. And he was the class of the people who were those sailors. And he wanted to create a character that basically was not a threat to the upper class like the sailors were, like the poor were. He didn't owe the man who owned the house, the narrator, anything, and the narrator didn't owe him anything. However, he was coming down and giving presents to the children and delivering gifts to the family. So by creating this character, Clement Clarke Moore was able to convert the wassailing type of persona to a benevolent person. He took the publicly celebrated Christmas from the outside and brought it indoors, and thus changing the face of Christmas and how it's celebrated in the United States from then on. Which brings us to myth number 2. Christmas has always been a family tradition with the emphasis on celebrating at home with loved ones. Well, again, this is something that's only been around since probably the mid-1820s, but it was the 1820s through the 1840s that this idea really came forth and really became popularized. It was also a time of converting the idea from children being not very much, they didn't have very much status in the family, to really raising them up, and they actually created the concept of children in this point. And it wasn't any concerted effort. I think that it was Clement Clarke Moore's poem that helped push that along, but then the popular media through books and magazines and newspapers really took that idea and ran with it. So children before that period of time were more or less considered the same status as servants were, but suddenly they became something more, and there were a couple of reasons for that. One was this idea of bringing Christmas into the house. The other was that the upper and middle class families wanted to keep their children out of the streets and away from the rowdy crowds that were starting to develop, the rowdiness that was going on in the Industrial Revolution urban dwellings. and the poor classes. So it was really a kind of a classist action on their part. It was a moral action on their part, and it was a way of teaching their children, but also protecting them and protecting their class as well as their own wealth. So the idea of Christmas being at home was celebrated through gift giving, through creating children's books, through games that children were playing at Christmas time, and also through these sort of moralistic tales of like how to behave at Christmas and how to behave the rest of the year, and really giving children a bigger status in the family, and celebrating the family as being something that was the place for Christmas, as opposed to the public holiday that was going on with the wassailers and the other activities that were going on, the drunkenness and the rowdiness that was taking place during the season of Christmas. Which brings us up to myth number 3. Christmas has always been too commercialized. Well, I hate to break it to you folks, but Christmas has always been too commercial. Since it started being celebrated in the 1820s, the way we celebrate it today, Christmas has always been a commercialized effort. Santa Claus is the perfect shill for advertisers, for shop owners. He was the perfect symbol to use on handbills and whatnot, advertising wares at Christmas time. At the same time, people were developing stage shows for the holiday season, and gift giving was rampant. The funny thing is that during that time, people were worried about the same things that we worry about today, such as, am I giving the right gift? And how can I make this gift a personalized thing to reflect the person that I'm giving this gift to? Is it authentic? If it isn't authentic, then it maybe looks like it might be handmade. Another thing that was developed were something called annuals, that were books that were published at the end of the year to be given specifically as Christmas presents. And then finally, people complained about the poor quality of the gifts that they would give children. The toys and the things that they would buy for the kids would often fall apart soon after the kids started playing with them. Sounds kind of familiar. Which then brings us to the myth number 4. Like Santa Claus, the Christmas tree is thought of as an age-old tradition, something that goes back centuries. Well, the Christmas tree does kind of go back centuries, but only in one place and at one time. In Strasbourg, Germany, in the Alsatian area, the Christmas tree started to appear around the early part of the 16th century, or 17th century, around the 1600s in the Baroque era. But it was only held on in this area for quite a few years, and only in this area. And it wasn't until 1874 that Goethe, the writer, wrote a book that included a Christmas tree scene. And from then, it took a long time to maybe the 1774. It wasn't until about 1810 that the Christmas tree started appearing in the elite homes of people in Berlin. And it wasn't until the 1820s that an American visitor named George Bancroft saw a Christmas tree for the first time and wrote about it in a letter to his father, who was a Unitarian minister. From then on, the Christmas tree was popularized in popular media, namely books and magazines. And the authors of those popular media articles promoting the Christmas tree were all, well, Unitarians. So why Unitarians? I don't know specifically why, but the Unitarians did have an agenda, and that was to raise the children up in the family even more, but to teach them moral values such as giving rather than just receiving. And the Christmas tree was the perfect tool to do that. Because what do you do with the Christmas tree? You put presents under the tree, or at the time they would hang presents on the tree. So this was a tool that would allow the family to participate in the gift exchange. The Christmas tree was that center of attention. It was that wonder that we all share now to this day. So the Unitarians really promoted the idea of the Christmas tree, not just as spectacle, but as a way of teaching children the value of giving, not just receiving. And then finally, myth number 5. Christmas is too secular, and Christ has been taken out of Christmas. Until early 19th century, Christmas was really, and that was the 1800s, by the way, for those of you keeping track at home, Christmas was only really celebrated by Catholics and by the Episcopalians in the United States. Christmas was really shunned and really outlawed by the Puritans in Massachusetts and in New England. Christmas was not celebrated by any of the Protestant religions except for the Episcopalians because of their roots in England. But in America, all the religions that were Calvinist-based and so forth, even the Unitarians, they just did not approve of Christmas. And part of the reason was because of the wassailing that came over from Europe as well. The holiday season was the season of debauchery and bacchanalian celebration, and it just wasn't something that they wanted to participate in. It was too worldly, or it was the other reason that the Puritans didn't like it is because, well, they didn't think that the 25th of December was the actual date that Christ was born. And in fact, it wasn't until the 4th century that the Catholic Church just randomly chose that date. The Puritans argued that that date was chosen because it came in the same period of time as the solstice, which usually happens on the 21st or 22nd of the month, which was a pagan ritual. So the Catholic Church, they accused the Catholic Church of basically appropriating the pagan ritual and applying the birth of Christ to it, which there's probably something to that. However, it wasn't until the 1800s that Unitarians and some other Calvinist type of religions started coming around and saying that we should start celebrating the birth of Christ. And this dovetailed with Clement Clark Moore's poem. So it's sort of a zeitgeist kind of thing that took place at the same time. So the funny thing is that people have been arguing about whether we should say Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays, and to tell you the truth, it really doesn't matter, because Christmas is always celebrated as a set of holidays or a period of time. So Happy Holidays is just as appropriate as Merry Christmas, because really the religions that have been saying we have to keep Christ in Christmas really weren't celebrating Christmas until just about 200 years ago. So it's kind of funny that it's come around and Christmas is thought of as this ancient thing that we all have been celebrating, and that it's too commercial, it's too secular, we're giving too many Christmas presents, and we're just it's something that we should be more reverent about. Well, the only people that were really reverent about Christmas were the Catholics, and well, that's all changed too. So I hope I haven't bummed you out too much, and I hope you all have a happy holiday and a Merry Christmas. Thank you. Oh, hey, JP Collins here again. By the way, speaking of Christmas, it's the time of giving, and it's something that we kind of need some support with, some help with. We'd really like a new microphone and some additional production equipment. So if you find it in your heart to give, go to the website bookofhours.com. That's book-of-hours, spelled O-U-R-S.com, and look for the support link. Click there, and you can give us money to help us purchase those items that we so desperately need. Thank you, and Merry Christmas.